Okay, ready to dive in. Today we're tackling affordable housing and comparing how Canada and the U.S. approach things.
Just a fascinating comparison.
Really is. And we've got this research article from 1993 by Peter Dreier and J. David Hulchanski.
The role of nonprofit housing in Canada and the United States. Some comparisons.
That's the one. And it's going to be eye-opening. We'll be looking at the policies, the politics, the long-term outcomes.
You'll see how these two countries, often seen as similar, took really different paths.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, Canada might just have some lessons for the U.S. So let's jump right in.
Right.
The article sets the scene, right? Both Canada and the U.S. started out with similar approaches to public housing,
Especially in those early years, yeah. Think those large-scale public housing projects.
like the ones we see in movies.
Exactly.
But things shifted dramatically in the 1970s. What happened?
Well, in the U.S., there was this growing dissatisfaction with those large-scale projects, maintenance issues, sometimes crime.
They weren't always the most successful.
Right. And this created an opening for a shift towards more market-based solutions.
Okay, so less government involvement.
Essentially, they started relying more on private developers for affordable housing.
And that was driven by...
Well, partly by lobbying from real estate interests, they saw an opportunity to tap into government subsidies.
to make a profit.
Exactly. But in Canada, things were going in a completely different direction.
So what was happening up north?
Well, they took this interesting turn towards what they called a third sector for social housing.
Third sector.
Yeah, basically supporting nonprofit organizations to develop and manage housing projects.
Nonprofits instead of for-profit developers.
It was a bold move, and it all stemmed from this critical self-reflection.
Like, they took a step back and said,
In 1969, a task force basically said, hey, this whole bulldozer approach to urban renewal and those huge public housing projects, not working.
they were willing to admit their mistakes.
Then try something new. The big turning point came in 1973 with amendments to the National Housing Act.
All right, those amendments. What was so groundbreaking about them?
Well, first, they focused on smaller scale buildings, low and mid-rise, designed to blend into existing neighborhoods.
A far cry from those isolated towers.
Exactly. And they really promoted mixed-income housing. No buildings exclusively for low-income residents.
So more integrated communities.
Exactly. And here's the big one. Rent geared to income, usually set at 25–30% of a household's income.
Affordable, based on what people could actually pay.
Right. And get this. The land in units, permanently removed from the real estate market.
Wait, permanently, so they couldn't be sold off later?
Not to private developers, no. Dedicated to affordable housing forever.
Wow. That's a world away from how things work in the U.S.
It created this permanent safety net of affordable housing, protected from speculation.
They were really thinking long-term.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about money. They invested in building the capacity of the nonprofit sector.
What does that mean? Building capacity.
Training, technical assistance, funding, helping those nonprofits become effective developers and managers.
Making them self-sufficient.
Right. So tell me, what comes to mind when you think of nonprofits in this context?
Well, I guess I imagine, small community groups, maybe churches.
It was actually much more diverse than that. You had what were called public nonprofits, essentially housing companies set up by local governments.
Also, even cities were involved.
Absolutely. And then you had the private nonprofits established by a wide range of groups. Churches, unions, community organizations.
Wow, so many different players.
But perhaps the most innovative model, cooperatives.
Cooperatives, like the residents themselves own and manage the housing.
That's right. A unique approach emphasizing democratic decision-making and responsibility.
Interesting. We should definitely unpack that more later.
We will, but it really highlights Canada's focus on empowering residents.
So we've got this picture of how Canada tackled affordable housing. Very community-driven, long-term vision.
Now, let's contrast that with the path the U.S. took, a more market-driven approach.
Yeah, let's see how things played out south of the border.
All right. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here. We've talked about the different approaches, but how do these systems actually get funded?
Right, because you can have the best intentions in the world, but without money, those intentions don't really translate into actual housing, do they?
Exactly. So let's start with Canada. Their system relies heavily on nonprofits, so where does the funding for those organizations come from?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. Because building and managing affordable housing, it's not cheap.
You're absolutely right. It requires significant investment, and Canada's been willing to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak.
So where does that money actually come from? Is it all from the government or are there other sources?
It's actually a mix, which I think is one of the things that makes it work so well. You've got government funding at multiple levels, you've got private investment, and then some really creative financing mechanisms.
Okay, let's break that down. Let's start with the government's role. What kinds of funding do they provide?
The federal government offers a variety of subsidies. They've got capital grants for construction and rehabilitation, but they also provide ongoing operating subsidies.
So it's not just a one-time thing to get a project started, it's ongoing support to make sure those units stay affordable.
Exactly. That long-term commitment is crucial because it gives nonprofits the stability they need to plan for the future, make sure the properties are well maintained, and provide that stable housing for residents.
It sounds like they're really trying to create a system that's sustainable over the long haul.
That's exactly right. But it's not all about government funding. They've also been really successful at attracting private investment.
Really? Because I wouldn't think affordable housing would be that appealing to private investors.
You'd be surprised. They've got some clever programs that offer tax breaks and other incentives that sweeten the deal.
So it's a win-win. Investors get a decent return, and communities get much-needed affordable housing.
Exactly. And they've been very careful to structure these partnerships so that they don't compromise affordability or that community-driven approach.
Now, you mentioned some creative financing mechanisms earlier. What did you have in mind?
Well, one example that stands out is their use of revolving loan funds.
Revolving loan funds. Okay, I'm not familiar with those. How do they work?
So basically, it's like a pool of money specifically for affordable housing. It starts with an initial investment, often from the government or philanthropy. Then that money is used to provide loans to nonprofits for their projects.
Okay, and then what happens when those loans are paid back?
That's the beauty of it. The money goes right back into the fund, so it can be used to finance more projects. It's this self-perpetuating cycle of investment.
Wow, that's a really cool idea. It's like this engine that just keeps generating more and more affordable housing.
That's a great way to put it. And it really shows how committed Canada is to finding innovative solutions, really thinking outside the box.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good understanding of how Canada funds its system. But let's switch gears now and talk about the U.S. How does it compare?
Well, remember, the U.S. relies much more on the private sector, so the funding landscape is quite different. It's much more fragmented.
So if the government isn't providing the same level of direct support, where does the money come from?
There are a few main sources. You've got federal tax credits, private investment, and then a lot of it comes down to local initiatives.
Let's start with those federal tax credits. What are we talking about here?
The big one is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC for short. It's basically a way to incentivize private investment in affordable housing by offering tax breaks.
So it's like using the tax code to encourage developers to build affordable units.
Exactly. And to be fair, it's been fairly successful at attracting investment. But it is a complicated system, which can be a barrier for smaller nonprofits.
I can imagine. It probably favors those larger developers who have more resources and expertise to navigate all the complexities.
That's a valid point. Now, private investment plays a big role too. We're talking banks, mortgage companies. They provide a lot of the financing for affordable housing projects in the U.S.
But wait, if these lenders are all about making a profit, why would they be interested in affordable housing, which generally has lower returns?
There are a few reasons. First, there are some government regulations, like the Community Reinvestment Act, that encourage banks to invest in underserved communities.
So there's a bit of a push to do the right thing.
You could say that. And it has been pretty effective in getting banks to consider community needs. But also, there's a growing number of investors who are specifically looking for socially responsible investment.
Oh, so it's not always just about the bottom line. Some investors are actually looking to make a positive impact with their money.
Exactly. And that's a really encouraging trend to see. Then on top of that, you've got all these local initiatives happening across the country.
Okay, like what kinds of things are cities and states doing to support affordable housing?
A lot of them are setting up housing trust funds, which are essentially dedicated pools of money for affordable housing projects.
Where does that money come from?
It can come from a variety of sources. Some cities use property taxes, others use linkage fees on new commercial development, those fees that developers have to pay when they build something new.
That's smart. It's like they're using the growth and development happening in their cities to help fund affordable housing.
Exactly. It's a really proactive approach. And then some cities are using inclusionary zoning policies, which require developers to include a certain percentage of affordable units in new construction.
So it's like baking affordability into new developments from the get-go.
Exactly. It's a way to prevent those patterns of segregation and make sure affordable housing is spread throughout the city.
So we've got Canada with its focus on long-term government support, innovative financing, and strong partnerships. And then we've got the U.S., which relies more on private investment, tax incentives, and these localized efforts. It's really fascinating to see the contrasts.
It is, and while there are definitely some challenges in both systems, it's clear that both countries are trying to find solutions to this incredibly complex issue.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, we've talked about the money, but ultimately it's all about the impact, right? What are the real-world outcomes of these different approaches?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about how these policies translate into actual improvements in people's lives. That's what really matters.
Okay, so let's dive into those outcomes. Let's see how these different approaches have played out in Canada and the U.S. and what lessons we can learn from their experiences.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's shift our focus now to the actual outcomes. We've talked about the different approaches, the funding mechanisms, but at the end of the day, what really matters is the impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. All these policies and programs, they need to translate into real, tangible improvements for people.
So let's start with Canada. Their system has been in place for a while now. What kind of results have they seen?
Well, the data is pretty encouraging. One of the most significant outcomes has been a reduction in homelessness, especially chronic homelessness.
That's a huge issue. And you're
Yeah.
saying Canada's approach has actually made a dent in that problem.
Yes, they've seen a notable decrease. And much of that success is attributed to their focus on providing stable, supportive housing. It's not just about giving someone a place to sleep for the night, it's about giving them a foundation to rebuild their lives.
It makes sense. If you have that stability, you can start to address other issues in your life.
Exactly. When people have a safe and affordable place to live, they're more likely to find jobs, access health care, and just generally improve their overall well being.
So it's really an investment in people, not just buildings.
Precisely. Canada has really embraced that philosophy, seeing housing as a fundamental human right, and it's reflected in their outcomes.
Okay, but what about the quality of the housing itself? We talk about how Canada's nonprofit housing tends to be well maintained, integrated into neighborhoods. Does that translate into a better experience for the residents?
It does. Studies have shown that residents of nonprofit housing in Canada report much higher levels of satisfaction with their homes compared to those in market rate rentals.
So they're not just grateful to have a roof over their heads, they actually like where they live.
Exactly. They feel a sense of community, they feel safe, and they appreciate the stability that comes with knowing they're not going to be priced out of their homes.
That's fantastic. It sounds like they've managed to create affordable housing that people are actually happy to live in.
That's one of the key goals, to create housing that's not just affordable, but also desirable. And by doing so, they're helping to break down that stigma that's often associated with affordable housing.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to the U.S. Their approach has been quite different, relying more on the private sector. Have they seen similar positive outcomes?
Well, it's a more complicated picture. On the one hand, they have been successful in attracting private investment, which has led to a lot of affordable units being built.
So, in terms of quantity, they've made some progress.
They have. However, as we discussed earlier, relying on the private sector also introduces some inherent challenges. The lack of long-term affordability requirements means that a lot of those units can eventually be converted back to market rate rentals.
Right, and that's a big problem, especially in areas where the need for affordable housing is so high. It creates a revolving door effect
Yeah.
where people are constantly at risk of losing their homes.
Exactly. It makes it very difficult for families to put down roots and build a sense of stability. And another concern is the concentration of poverty that often results from this approach. When affordable housing is primarily located in low-income neighborhoods, it can actually reinforce existing inequalities.
So it's not just about the number of units, it's about where those units are located and how they're integrated into the community as a whole.
That's a crucial point. And that's where Canada's emphasis on mixed income housing and community integration has really paid off. By intentionally creating more diverse neighborhoods, they're fostering a more equitable and inclusive society.
This comparison has been incredibly eye-opening. It seems pretty clear that Canada's long-term investment in nonprofit housing has yielded some really positive results.
It has. Their experience really demonstrates that a holistic, community-oriented approach can work. When you prioritize stability and affordability, you create a much more just and equitable housing system.
Whereas the U.S., while successful in some areas, continues to grapple with those issues of instability and affordability.
Right. And while both systems have their strengths and weaknesses, I think there's a lot the U.S. can learn from Canada's example. The importance of long-term funding, community engagement, and really thinking about the long-term impact of housing policies.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what key takeaways should our listeners keep in mind? What's the big picture lesson here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no magic bullet, no one-size-fits-all solution to the affordable housing crisis. Every community is unique with its own set of needs and challenges.
Right, so it's about finding the right approach for each specific context.
Exactly. But I think Canada's experience shows us that investing in a strong nonprofit housing sector can be a really effective way to create more stable, more equitable, and just more thriving communities.
And that's a goal we can all get behind.
Absolutely. And it's something we can all contribute to, whether it's through supporting local organizations, advocating for better policies, or simply raising awareness about the issue. We can all make a difference.
Well said. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of affordable housing. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope it sparked some important conversations. We'll catch you next time for another insightful exploration. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.